I wanted to talk to you today about this project because it is one that's currently very actively under development. It's my own branch of a larger project that's seeking computational approaches to concepts. What are they? How do we think about them? How do they evolve over time? This is a group that I've been working with here, led by Dan Jurafsky in the linguistics department. And it's a number of different scholars that are coming together and thinking through how can we apply computational methods to the history, the meaning, the idea of concepts. And so for my own set of interests, this gave me the opportunity to think about concepts, specifically 18th century concepts, specifically a particular kind of concept in the 18th century, and explore new ways of not only thinking through how to define what a concept might be, or at least this particular kind of concept, but thinking through how to visualize it, not as a way of presenting information to an audience, but as a research methodology in and of itself. In other words, the visualizations, most of them anyway, that I'm going to show you today are still a bit experimental, and so are not my most, as I warned you, lucid of visualizations. But again, they're not necessarily designed to show work or communicate work to an audience, rather to arrange information such that we can use them as a jumping off point for new ways of understanding concepts and, more importantly, conceptual history in the 18th century. So the particular kind of concept that I am interested in actually comes from an 18th century idea of how ideas, concepts are constructed. And I've given you some examples from across the century, from Locke's essay on human understanding, through Burke's philosophical inquiry into the sublime and the beautiful, and then the very first encyclopedia written in English, Ephraim Chambers' Encyclopedia. And all of them describe what they call complex ideas. And these are ideas or concepts that have a very particular thing in common, which is they're non-representative. That is, these are ideas of or concepts that don't, according to these thinkers, reflect actual objects in the world, but rather are compounded or come together by mixing what they would call simpler concepts into more complex forms. So Locke, for example, talks about complex ideas, not only making even a new idea, but putting together those which the mind had before. Or Burke's, here again are two ideas not presentable by language, and a union of them great and amazing beyond conception. And they probably be called ideas, which present no distinct image to the mind, but still it would be difficult to conceive how words can move passions, etc., etc. So these are concepts that bring together representational ideas. Representational ideas being like ideas like table, or ideas like stare, or ideas like yellow. Those are things that Locke, for example, would argue are reflected in the world around us. But he's interested in concepts of things like justice, which are intangible. Or, and more closely aligned to the ones that I'm interested in, concepts like political justice or human rights or free speech. Words or concepts, that show their complexity through the language from which they are assembled. So this is my schematic of the thing that I'm interested in, the kind of conceptual evolution. And it's deeply simplified, although you'll see it in more complex forms coming up. But the mechanism that all of the thinkers I've talked about describe is effectively this. Time is on the y-axis, so you read it from bottom to top, earlier to later. And then the x-axis shows us a kind of conceptual space, occupied at the earliest stage by two different terms, which I believe are term 1 and term 1, for at least I can't remember. But they're equivalent terms that evolve such that they come closer together until eventually they bind into a compound concept. So something like political injustice, for example, would start off as a concept of political and a concept of justice that over time will co-evolve such that when they come into contact, they'll bind together and give us political justice, which is a combination of the two, but something that is different from either one by itself. It's more than simply the combination of political justice in that it creates something new. Or moral sentiments, for example. I was working earlier. The same deal, that moral and sentiment will come together at a particular point. And here we can imagine that might be Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments into a single point from which will emerge the concept of moral sentiments. So the original question of this project is, why do some concepts stick? Why do some words do this and others don't? And in fact, the larger project of which this is a part, I'm not going to talk too much about that. My real interest here is not just why some stick, but why they don't stick. Are there occasions, in other words, where two words will look like they're coming together, like moral and sentiment, have all of the same features, and yet fail to produce one of these compound concepts? This is something that we haven't really been able to track before. This is not something we've really been able to think about before. And what I'm hoping is that the work that I'm doing will give us the ability to ferret out these kinds of failed concepts. So how do we look at concepts? There are a couple of different ways. Actually, I want to skip that slide and come back to it. There's a couple of different ways to approach what we might call semantic distance, that is the x-axis in the schematic that I showed you. Option one, we have something like collocation. This is where we can go through and say two words are closer together or they're more related when they appear together frequently. That is, if two words appear together a lot in the same sentence, we can claim that there's some kind of relationship between them, and the more frequently they appear, the closer they are. The advantages here are a clear method of association, and we can directly calculate their relationship. If we say things are closer when they appear more often, we can calculate how often they appear. The downside is they're only capable of showing one kind of association, that is syntagma. Things that appear often together are more similar. It doesn't let us think through other ways in which two words might be associated. Option number two would be something like word embeddings or vector spaces. Words are similar when they share similar contexts. In other words, it doesn't really matter how often two words appear together if they frequently appear in the same context. In other words, if they're substitutable, either positively or negatively for each other. So example, I could say next week I'm flying to Paris, or I could say next week I'm flying to New York. And the relationship between Paris and New York has to do with the fact that they're entirely substitutable into the same kind of sentence with the same words, even though they would give the sentence different meanings. But they're substitutable for each other in the same grammatical context. So the advantage here is that it allows for a dense representation of measures of distance, but it also gives us a complex form of association. They can be syntagmatically associated. They could be synonyms, they could be antonyms. It gives us lots of ways to think through what it means for things to be related. But the problem is that means it's somewhat unclear why any two words are related. Are they synonyms, or do they appear next to each other a lot? The disadvantage is that most vector models, like the popular ones, like word2vec or glove, are probabilistic. That is, they depend on probabilistic models, and it is difficult to compare them over time. So for example, in word2vec models, up to 52% of the variation between two different models is due to random variation in the models, unless you do a lot of hard mathematical work to correct them. Since I'm interested in measuring things over time, I wanted to look at a way of creating these kinds of embedding spaces, but in a way that's not probabilistic. So what I did is, and I'm happy to go more into this in the Q&A, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but what I did is I'm using a non-probabilistic embedding method. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at word co-occurrence and then using a seeded SVD to collapse that into a dense vector representation. It works exactly like a word embedding like love or word2vec, but its advantage is, one, I know why two words are similar because they're based on co-occurrence within the same text, but at a scale that we can extrapolate them to detect shared contexts. But more importantly, models can be aligned over time. Because of the fact they're not probabilistic, we can compare two models, one earlier, one later, and the distance or the difference over time is representative of the difference in how the words are used, not just model variation. Okay, so what did I do exactly? I created this. This is my embedding model over time. Here's I used the 18th century collections online corpus, which has lots of advantages in that there's a lot of material, about 6.3 billion words, about 159,000 unique texts. It's well tagged. The OCR is not great. It's deeply canonical. So there are positives and negatives, but it's the best. It's the best representation of 18th century writing that we have, with a lot of caveats that I'd be happy to go more into. So using this corpus, I built a non-probabilistic vector model for all of the texts in 5-year increments. So all of the texts written between 1700 and 1705, between 1705, 1710, 1710, 1750, etc. And you can see that it's not quite evenly distributed. Each one of those bars represents the size of the corpus of those 5-year increments. There's much more at the end of the century than at the beginning, but this gives us a way to compare word relationships over time. So once we have that, we have to choose how we want to represent those relationships. And word embeddings have a couple of different ways that they're typically represented. And none of them work exactly well for what I want it to do. Because remember, what I want to do is I want to trace the relationships of two words, both to each other and to the context they're embedded in, and watch as they evolve over the course of the 18th century. So we can use some kind of dimensional reduction, either a TS&E plot or a principal component analysis, to do different time slices, right? So we can do a principal component analysis or TS&E for each of the 5-year increments, and we can look at them in sequence and watch how they evolve. And if we did that, we have something like this. Here, each one of these dots represents a word. You can see what I've done is just created a new plot for different 5-year increments. This is not all 100 of them. This is only the last, I think, 6 or 7. But we can see how different things get closer and farther away. And this is typically how these kinds of things have been visualized. But there are some problems associated with this. Not only are these diagrams complicated, and it's difficult to sort of keep track of where individual words are. Looking at them in these slides makes it difficult, and the position is relative in terms of their distance from each other, but completely random in terms of where they are on the graph. That is, the meaning of these types of diagrams have to do with the distance of two dots, of the relationship, not where they're situated on the graph. So when you look at it over time, it's really difficult to keep track of exactly what these differences are. So other groups who are interested in looking at these kinds of questions or concepts visualize the embedding space as a network. And the advantage here is that it better represents the relationships between specific terms, and it focuses on the connections between them. But the problem is that the layout is also probabilistically determined, and network visualizations are a problem because they're effectively meaningless, and we want to read meaning into them. So for example, This is a visualization of the concept political and the concept revolution, which is the one I'm focusing on. And you can see, you can't probably quite see, but this is political here, and this is revolution down here. The red nodes are words that are attached to political but not revolution in 1795. And the blue nodes are words that are attached to revolution but not political. And then the purple ones are what they share. And this gives us a good representation of how these two words are related, but it distorts it in certain ways. It's not really that neat that all of the political words are together on one side and the revolution words are together on the other side. And again, this gives us a snapshot at 1795, but it doesn't show how they evolve. So, I wanted to try something different. I wanted to look at similarity between two words over time. So the embedding spaces allow us to calculate the similarity between any two terms, that is their distance within the embedding space. We can make multiple kinds of measurements at once, and because the model is all aligned, because it's non-probabilistic, we can track this reliably over time. So, for example, this line represents the similarity. It's not quite the distance. It's a cosine similarity. The similarity of political and revolution over time. So the higher the line is on the axis, the more similar those two words are. And the lower the line is, the less similar they are. So what this line shows us, without giving us a whole lot of information, is that the two words start off actually very different. And over the course of the 18th century, they grow a lot closer together. The line lets us visualize history in a way that those snapshots don't. But we also lose a lot of information when we visualize the relationship this way. So what we can do is we can change up the graph by rotating it and making it a little bit more complicated. This is not super easy to see, and I'm sorry about that. The contrast isn't so high, but now what we've got are two symmetrical lines, one representing political in red, one representing revolution in blue on the left and right, that echo the schematic that I showed you at the very beginning. That is, the x-axis, it's very tiny, I'm sorry, year is here from 1700 to 1800. And the y-axis now represents semantic distance. That is, the farther apart the two lines are, the less like each other the words are. And the closer together, the more like each other they are. So semantic distance versus time. The dotted lines that connect them indicate points at which the two words begin to overlap. So a dotted line from the red line to the center indicates, for example, that political has become a top term of revolution, and the opposite indicates that revolution has become a top term of political, and when it's all the way across, it suggests that they're top terms of each other. So it's a kind of joining. And what we can do is actually put the words that join them in the middle. Here, all I've done is filled in the middle of the two lines with words that both share. So for example, at the very earliest, the only words that political and revolution share are popular and preservation, whereas at the top, they now share national, civil, political, and national. So there are terms that bring, for example here, political and revolution together. On the other hand, we can look at the terms outside. Here on the left next to political are words associated with political that are not associated with revolution. And on the right, words associated with revolution that are not associated with political. So for example, at the top, when we saw that they're coming together, moral and religious are associated with political but not with revolution, whereas reform and revolutions are associated with revolution but not political. So if we put it all together, what we get is a representation of these words over time that lets us see what's bringing them together, that is those words in the middle, and what's pushing them up or pulling them apart, that is on the words on the outside. So if we imagine political as a concept that inhabits a lexical space, The words on the outside of political are the parts of its shared lexemes that are pulling it away from revolution, whereas the words in the center are the parts of political that are pulling it towards revolution. And by looking at it this way, we can understand the history of concept as a collection of semantic and conceptual forces, and allow us to understand how these words co-evolved over time. Okay, what can we do with this? Well, there's one other thing that this graph doesn't actually show, but actually lets you do. One of the advantages of looking at things in embedding space is that you can do math with them. That is one of the reasons why there's been a lot of work on using embedding spaces to think about concepts is because you can think about the relationship between words within this kind of semantic space as a set of mathematical operations, so like very literally mathematical operations. So here, this is my favorite example. Usually when you listen to vector talks on vector spaces or embedding, the classic example is, what is it? It's king minus man plus woman brings you to queen, which is really boring and deeply problematically gendered. So this is my favorite example, which is if you take in an embedding model, the vector representing shirt, you subtract the vector representing arms, and you add the vector representing legs. This is the semantic neighborhood that you wind up in. You wind up with pants, trousers, jeans, shorts, etc. In other words, one of the ways of understanding what this vector model shows is that the relationship between shirt and pants has to do with what body parts are associated. In other words, pants are the shirts of the legs. This is a way of navigating around vector space and seeing different kinds of relationships. But what really excited me when I started playing with this is that the graphs that I showed you actually give us a representation of that math. So for example, if we take revolution political on the left and revolution on the right, the words that they share and don't share actually give us a formula to get from one to the other. So if I just use the words on the graph and I take political and I subtract politics, but I add diurnal, rotation, and monarchy, that actually gets me to a semantic neighborhood that includes revolution. So that the graphs themselves represent these kinds of transformational relationships between the terms that I'm interested in. Similarly, if I take at a different point in the graph, this is up at the top at 1795, if I take political and subtract moral but add civil, I again wind up in the semantic neighborhood of revolution. And the difference between these two is the length of the journey to get from one to the other. This is another good representation of the distance between the words that I'm interested in. It takes much more work to get from political to revolution in 1725 than it does in 1795. So it's another way of understanding how close or distant these words are from each other. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, here are two different words, for example, ones I'm particularly interested in, Sublime and Imagination. And this graph is exactly like the others, 1700 to 1800, but now we can see the relationship between Sublime and Imagination. What we can see from the very beginning, without even looking at the words themselves, is that, again, these two words approach over the course of the 18th century. They start off not super far apart, but they definitely grow more like each other over the course of the period. Here, for example, Sublime begins the century as a rhetorical term. It's much more associated with lofty, with metaphors, and with words like rapture. It's got a deeply religious set of connotations. But by the end of the century, the Sublime becomes the space of mental and philosophical activity, which brings it much closer to the idea of imagination. As Sublime Imagination becomes a concept, in other words, it pulls imagination to itself and away from the language of sensuous experience, which is where imagination had been embedded. In other words, this shows us how these two words come together and the semantic and conceptual mechanisms behind the ways in which they become more associated. The opposite, you might say, would be something like monarchy and government. Here, it's a bit more subtle, but here you can see, rather than come closer together over the course of the century, monarchy and government become disassociated across the 18th century. For example, government becomes more associated with the discourse of laws and authority, whereas monarchy becomes associated with the aristocracy and despotism. And it works against the growing sense of rule of law at the heart of government. As governmental institutions in England, and again, it's worth remembering, and this is a limitation of the study that I'm not fond of. Since I'm working with the echo corpus, I'm working with a corpus from the UK. So the concepts that I'm looking are not only embedded in English, the language, they're also embedded in 18th century UK or British politics. But this lets us see again how these two terms, monarchy and government, not become associated, but actually separate out, and echoes a lot of the political transformations that happen over the course of the century in England. This I just put in because I love it. This is the thing, like I said, I'm looking for. This is the failed concept. This is moral inadequacy. You can see at the bottom, they begin actually quite far apart. And then, like all of those other sublime imagination, revolution, moral sentiments, they approach each other towards the middle of the century. They look like they're about to come in contact with each other, and then they diverge at the end of the century. This is a concept that looked like it was going to emerge and then failed. This is the thing that we can't detect, I don't think, outside of these kinds of methods. And in fact, what I did to find this is I looked at the shape of the graph, and I looked for all of the graphs between any two words in my corpus that have this shape. So I can pull out concepts that strongly come together. I can pull out concepts that greatly diverge. And most importantly, I can pull out concepts with this particular shape that come together at some point in the century and then diverge. This is a particularly interesting one because what happens here, and this is something that I'm still very much working on, but what happens here is that inadequacy and moral come together over this really quantitative discourse that is all of a sudden ethics or morality becomes deeply imbricated with this idea of having enough virtue, having enough ethics, which is very much in line with utilitarian philosophy that emerges in the middle of the 18th century. But as you move forward in time, what happens with the emergence of things like idealism is that morality actually is pulled away from this kind of accountancy of sufficiency or of quantitative metrics, and much more towards things like the Kantian categorical imperative, whereas inadequacy becomes even more associated with this kind of counting. So what we can see in this kind of failed concept is a series of philosophical revolutions that try and bring it together before forcing it apart. So those are the different kinds of things that one can do with this kind of diagram and these kinds of quantitative investigations. I wanted to focus by way of not really concluding, but by way of sort of illustrating what it is we're trying to do here, by focusing on a particular one that I've already brought up, that is political revolution, because these give us an overview and allow us to see certain kinds of transformations that I don't think we can see otherwise. But when we actually dig deeply into them and start looking at these associations, they can reveal relationships and certain kinds of historical transformations that are really difficult to detect through more traditional literary or historical forms of research. And I'm interested in political revolution. You can see it here used by Mary Wollstonecraft in the Vindication of the Rights of Men, her earlier work responding to William Burke's work on the revolution in France. I agree with you, sir, that the pulpit is not the place for political discussions, though it might be more excusable to enter on such a subject when the day was set apart merely to commemorate a political revolution and no stated duty was approached upon. Wollstonecraft here is responding to Burke's accusations of English support for the French Revolution, which is ongoing at the time, particularly on the part of certain radical preachers that used the day that commemorates the glorious revolution of the end of the 17th century to talk about the necessity of revolution and to argue that England was also in need of the same kind of thing that was happening in France. And what's really interesting is that she uses this term political revolution as a compound concept, as something that her audience should understand in line with something like political discussions. So my interest in that is, how does that term emerge? Where does that come from? How do we understand it in terms of the history of these two words? Now, as I suggested before, these two words join very clearly and very strongly over the course of the century. There's a very deep bend here in 1780, which, as you might imagine, has something to do with the revolution that's happening at that moment. So in some ways, this is a deeply explicable graph. Through the century, all of a sudden, the words are sort of coming closer together, but then we have a fairly major revolution in Europe, and the two join and then come together. And so there's a historical explanation for this, but it doesn't give us a full accounting of what's going on here. What's really interesting is over here in the words that are pulling revolution away from political, particularly in the middle of the century, is we have a strong turn into physics. So the words over here are revolutions, rotation, planet, revolve, diurnal. This is very much a Newtonian discourse of things turning. Whereas political stays pretty close to policy, national politics, etc. So while we might say that there's like a historical explanation here, there are microhistories happening that I think are a little bit less explicable that this kind of work I think can help us unpack. For example, as I said, revolution seems to take a turn towards science and away from, by the way, at the beginning of the century, it's the glorious revolution that when people are talking about revolution in the early part of the Echo Corpus, it is the glorious revolution that they are mostly talking about. And then we go into the mechanical revolution, the Newtonian revolution, and then the words that bring them together: national, civil, political, constitution, monarchy, administration. This is the discourse of the French Revolution. And so what I'm interested in is that now that we can see this history, how do we get from here to here to here? Well, it's a super complicated question, which I can't unpack entirely here. But there are some really suggestive elements to it. This is political and science. In other words, it traces the history of politics and science over the course of the 18th century. And what's really interesting is that once again, we see this kind of approach to each other. This is politics leaving the purely humanistic, purely pragmatic discourse in which it was embedded at the beginning of the century and becoming much more imbricated with the emerging social sciences of the 18th century. That is, we find something called political science emerging. And so politics becomes not simply a pragmatic way of talking about the current government of the country, but a discipline, a way of not just knowing politics, but being able to talk about the mechanics of political change, and importantly, in the hands of some thinkers, a potentially predictive way of understanding politics, both explanatory and something that we can use to look at the current situation and make speculative judgments on what's happening. What's really interesting is that although they're much farther apart, revolution and science also have a coming together late in the century. So at the same time as we have political and revolution coming together, that is post 1780, we also have revolution and science coming together. So when revolution inherits the discursive space of political, it also simultaneously inherits the discursive space of science. So it's not really just a two-term complex idea of qua loc, in which revolution and political are brought together by historical circumstances. It's actually a more complicated historical conceptual evolution in which both revolution and political are mediated by an emerging discourse of science. In other words, for revolution and political to come together into the concept of political revolution that Wollstonecraft deploys, what has to happen is that both of them have to become associated with different kinds of science. And so when we look at the graph that shows the two of them coming together, what we see is a kind of history that's carved out of the texts that are deploying these terms. So for example, revolution is coming from texts like King William's Ghost, political tracts mostly. Revolution at the middle of the century is coming from scientific treaties, the elements of astronomy. In other words, the texts bringing revolution into contact with the Glorious Revolution are the political tracts. The ones bringing revolution into contact with science are, for example, the elements of astronomy. And then when the two come together, we get things like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, that is, texts that mobilize both political and revolution within the emerging Enlightenment framework of science, or the emerging framework of Enlightenment science, I should say, that finally bring these discourses together. So, to conclude, by visualizing sequences of embeddings as a distribution over time, we can follow the specific historical trajectory of these compound ideas. These kinds of complex corpora, which include labeled genres, can help us tease apart the contexts of our embedding models such that we can trace the movement of ideas between different domains. And finally, and this is really important, and I think one of the advantages of understanding concepts in this way, concepts are embedded in genre and media, and recovering their history can also help us make sense of the complex communication environment from which these ideas emerge. Thank you so much.